Welcome to Middle East Dialogues, a series of conversations with leading scholars and writers, produced by the University of Denver's Center for Middle East Studies. Your host for this episode's dialogue is Associate Director Danny Postel. Our guest is Stuart Schaar, Professor Emeritus of Middle East and North African History at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. He is the co-editor of two books, The Middle East and Islamic World Reader, a historical reader for the 21st century, and The Birth of the Arab Citizen and the Changing Middle East. He is also the author of Eqbal Ahmad, Critical Outsider in a Turbulent Age, an intellectual biography of the late Middle East scholar, political organizer, and newspaper columnist Eqbal Ahmad.
Well, firstly, Stuart, welcome to Denver. It is a true pleasure to have you here on our campus at the University of Denver as a guest of our Center for Middle East Studies.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Stuart, I think it's fair to say that this book, this biography of your very dear friend Eqbal Ahmad, was very much a labor of love, wasn't it?
Well, it was more than that. I had to do a lot of research because you never know anybody, even if you're very close. There are, especially somebody as complicated as Eqbal was, there are layers upon layers upon layers. And therefore I traveled to India, Pakistan, Canada, throughout the United States.
I believe there were some interviews in London.
In London.
Paris.
Yes. I tracked down people who knew him and really got a 360-degree picture of what my friend was all about.
And that's really fascinating because, as you say, he was your friend, in fact, a dear friend.
And we wrote together, we were activists together, we did a lot of things together. But you never know anybody fully, and if you're writing a biography, you better know a lot. And I didn't know enough when I began. And I worked in his archive at Hampshire College, where he taught for 15 years, and it was a revelation. It was incredible.
So let's back up a little bit, Stuart, because one of my, I think, laments, and I think many of us share this sense. One of my laments is that a lot of people, especially younger people these days, really don't know the name Eqbal Ahmad. They may have heard it, but his work and his life are not as familiar now as they once were. And so, and I think that's why this biography is so important. But let's back up and talk about who Eqbal Ahmad was.
Well, the first thing you should know is that he never wrote that big book that goes along with celebrity.
Right.
What he did was write newspaper articles and journal articles throughout his life because his aim was to teach people and to motivate them to foster change, positive change.
Right.
And that's not what most academics have as their agenda.
So he was an academic and a scholar. He had a PhD from Princeton, but he wrote really with a sense of political purpose and urgency, didn't he?
And he was a wonderful writer and a wonderful editor. You would give him something and he would tear it apart very nicely. And then you would go back and redo and then submit again, and he would tear it apart again. But he was a consummate editor. I mean, he was really fantastic at that level.
Speaking of which, he was actually, one of the main chapters of his life was that he was the editor of a journal called Race and Class that was published in the UK.
It originally was called Race. He came on board and it really was in its heyday in the 1980s and early 90s and produced some very interesting articles. He had special issues in there on the Palestinian question and on the Iranian Revolution, which he turned into a book in Pakistan.
And there was a special issue on the Lebanese Civil War, if I
That's
recall.
right. And I contributed to all of them. So I followed it very, very closely. I met Eqbal first in 1958, a long time ago. We entered Princeton University as graduate students. It was a pretty elite institution in those days because they only accepted 500 students. Today they have close to 5,000. And all the students were well selected and they were really brilliant. It was quite a place to be. And it was difficult, it wasn't easy. And I discovered later in life that what they really taught us, aside from subject matter, which we had to master, and Arabic, which both of us had to learn from scratch, they taught us how to deal with stress. And it's been invaluable in my own life. Nothing phases me. I have deadlines and boom, they're done. Because after Princeton in those days, we had hours and hours of Arabic. We had 3 seminars, writing a paper a week for each seminar. We were going crazy. And Eqbal was brilliant, and even he was going crazy. And we would stay up until 3 in the morning, almost every evening, Monday through Friday, working on Arabic to be ready for an 8 o'clock class for 2 hours. We started out with 3 people in the class. 1 dropped out, so it was Eqbal and myself facing the professor who wrote the textbook that we were using. So we had to be prepared. There was no way around it.
Right, trial by fire. And Eqbal, just to be clear, had come to Princeton directly from Pakistan.
No, he spent a year in Occidental College.
In Los Angeles.
Working on the Hollywood vision of Native Americans.
That's right.
And he used that material in order to deal with stereotyping of Middle Easterners in the United States and how Hollywood treated them, almost like cowboys and Indians,
Right.
with them being the Indians, not the cowboys.
So let's situate Eqbal's contribution, Stuart, which is really what this book is about, who Eqbal was and what contributions he made to our understanding of the world. You make the case very forcefully and very early on in the book that Eqbal was one of the most visionary and indeed prescient critics and analysts of world politics and U.S. foreign policy in particular.
He had an uncanny sense of the future. And it was built on very hard work, which he never showed anybody. As far as other people were concerned, it seems as if his knowledge was gained effortlessly. That's completely wrong. He read extensively, really extensively. And
in several languages.
Yes, in Urdu, in French, and later in Arabic, and of course in English. His sister told me that when he was 5 years old, his English was as good as a kid in the 3rd grade. So from early on, he mastered English. And he was an orator, absolutely extraordinary, either at a dinner table or in a classroom or before an audience of 3,000 to 5,000 people. And he was never afraid. He would walk out and he was totally composed. He used to start very softly, and the audience was at the edge of their chair, and he did it on purpose, and then he would say, "Do you hear me? Do you hear me?" all the time. And he would reach crescendos when he spoke.
He was a performer, in a sense.
He was an Indian storyteller of the best kind. Now, his forte was predicting the future of international relations. He was the first to understand, after interviewing Osama bin Laden,
Which was when? When did he first interview him?
1986
Okay.
in Pakistan. And he came away understanding that Osama bin Laden would become an enemy of the United States, while he was an ally with the United States, before anybody ever imagined that he would become an enemy. Secondly, he interviewed Khomeini in Paris, in Persian, in Farsi.
Just before the Iranian Revolution, before Khomeini's return on the victory flight
That's right.
to Iran in February 1979.
And he came away from there, and also after interviewing people in his entourage, again using their language, understanding that this was going to be a dictatorship, and that the elected president would have no power, that all was in the hands of the great leader.
Now this, in retrospect, that seems like a no-brainer, but the fact is that at the time, Iqbal was very much arguing against the grain, especially within his own milieu.
No, especially among the leftists of the United States, who all thought that Iran's revolution was going to lead to a new beginning of democracy and whatnot. And they hated the fact that he hogged all the conversation, but in the long run, he was the only one who had it right.
To what do you attribute that prescience and that insight that Iqbal possessed about things like the future of the Iranian Revolution?
He was well trained. He got an MA degree in one of the best colleges in Pakistan called Foreman Christian College, which was later annexed after independence to Punjab University. He taught there after studying there, and he got a medal for the best grades of the whole university in history and English.
But surely it can't just be his academic training. I mean, there were other very rigorously trained academics.
Yeah, he had a brain.
Well, but
it helps.
The sense I got from your book, Stuart, is that Iqbal was a true citizen of the world. He was what we used to call a third worldist, but he was really truly an internationalist.
But it didn't come easy. He began as an ultra-nationalist.
Pakistani nationalist.
For Pakistani. He was a leftist without being a Leninist, without being a communist. And Princeton made him into a cosmopolitan radical. Now that sounds strange, because Princeton is the bastion of American ideology. I had people in my seminars who were thrown out because they were crude Marxists in Princeton. And if you're out of a seminar, you have to leave the university. They won't keep you.
So Princeton was a nerve center of American power and a kind of a training ground for the best and the brightest.
For the elite.
And yet, paradoxically, here comes this young man from Pakistan with left-wing inclinations, and you say it
radicalized him even more
him.
And made him into a cosmopolitan intellectual. Things were thrown at him that he had to react to. There's another thing. We were there in the late 50s, and there was terrible conformity in the United States. We had gone through McCarthyism, and the remnants of McCarthy was still around. And I would take Iqbal to Greenwich Village to listen to the Beats, to go to pocket-sized theaters where people were rebelling against the conformity. And it was an incredible opening up for him as he saw Allen Ginsberg screaming out Howl, his most famous poem, in the Figaro Cafe. It was unbelievable. Whereas in Princeton, it was prim, proper, Wall Street, people lived there, commuted to work. It was just the opposite.
So that's actually a big part of the story, is the way that you provided a corridor between Princeton and New York City, and that specific
Well,
cultural...
I'm a born New Yorker. I love the place.
You are a New Yorker. And
Sure.
later, Eqbal became a New Yorker.
Yes, and he loved it.
Right, and one of the most moving descriptions in the book, Stuart, is of Eqbal's kitchen. You say that he and his wife Julie, would come to host some of the most extraordinary and vibrant dinner gatherings, and that his home, his apartment in New York, became almost like a salon of third world intellectuals and activists and poets and organizers. Talk about that scene a little bit.
New York in those days, in the 80s, was equivalent to Bloomsbury in London, where Virginia Woolf was the hostess of the most intelligent people in Great Britain. You would walk into Eqbal's house never knowing who was going to be there. And people, when they came to New York, called up, they wanted to meet him. He had published overseas. People knew the name. They had read his work. And it was an honor to be at his table.
But he made a point of cultivating this, right? When he heard, as you say in the book, when he heard that a certain writer or organizer from the Third World was coming to New York, he made a point of seeking them out and inviting them over for dinner. And you say he was a great cook.
It's more than just the Third World. It was universal. Anybody who was smart, anybody who was left of center, ate at his table. And you never knew who was going to be there. And I would pop in whenever I felt like, because Eqbal, in effect, adopted me as his younger brother without ever saying so. And therefore, I had total entree. His best friend in New York, Edward Said, lived close by. He, too, had a salon. It was scintillating. It was extraordinary. I had another friend whose biography I'm writing as well, an African-American woman who died at 47 and had 5 lives. She was extraordinary. She was the head of social pediatrics at Montefiore Hospital, and we all knew each other. I mean, this was a circle. And she would put on benefits at a brownstone, 3 stories without doors. Each story had a benefit. And I would go from Eqbal's to Edwards to her place. It was paradise in New York in those days.
Noam Chomsky was another friend of
Yes.
Eqbal's, and he once referred, you quote it in the book, he referred to Eqbal as a secular Sufi. Tell us a little bit, what did he mean by that?
Well, Sufis search knowledge. Sufis go hunting for understanding of the universe. And that was Eqbal. And he was secular, but at the same time, he was Muslim.
Culturally Muslim, civilizationally Muslim.
Oh, he adored the Islamic civilization. And he grew up in it, and he relished it.
He knew its poetry and its intellectual history intimately.
He had a rare gift, and it was a gift of grace. He was able to read a poem once and memorize it for life. And he used to entertain us over dinner by reciting some of the great Urdu poets and translating them simultaneously, a world that none of the Americans had ever come in contact with. And it was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. The visions, the ideas. The greatest modern Pakistani poet, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, was his great friend. And he knew all of his poems by heart. I heard all of Faiz's corpus from Eqbal, who then translated what he wrote as he read it from memory.
Extraordinary.
Something extraordinary happened. At the beginning, when we were studying Arabic, he had known Persian, he had known Urdu and English. Persian and Urdu are Indo-European languages, and English is apart. So therefore, when he came to studying Arabic, which is an Afro-Asian language, people call it Semitic, he was lost. No matter how bright you are, it's a hard thing to go through, second only to Chinese and
Did
Ottoman
it help, though,
Turkish.
being an Urdu speaker and reader? Did
No,
it
there
help
were only loan words.
But the Arabic alphabet must have helped a bit.
You learn that in one day in Princeton. I spent 6 months in an extension course learning the alphabet. You come in one day, you know the alphabet, and if you don't, you're out.
Wow.
So you know it.
Wow.
Okay? That's how it was. That wasn't the problem. It was the grammar and the synonyms. It's a living language since the 3rd century, and each century has its vocabulary. You go crazy with the 98 words for camel, depending on what it's doing. So that Eqbal was lost, like all of us were. Initially, he went to the library, found a medieval poem which explained Arabic grammar. He memorized it on the spot. He came running in, screaming at me, I got it, I got it. I said, what do you got? He said, I know Arabic now. And from then on, he sailed. It was
a eureka moment.
It was incredible.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about some of the things Eqbal did in his life. You mentioned that he taught at Hampshire College for 15 years. He edited the journal Race and Class. He also he founded and directed something called the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, which was associated with
I spent 3 months with him there.
Talk about that a little bit. What was the Transnational Institute, which still exists, by the way, and what was Eqbal's role in it?
The Transnational Institute was funded by Sam Rubin, who is Cora Weiss's father. Cora Weiss is one of the most important anti-war activists, and she helped fund the movement against the war. Cora was a great friend of Eqbal's and introduced him to her father, who adored him immediately. And when he set up this transnational center in Amsterdam, he recruited Eqbal, who was then with the Institute of Policy Studies
in Washington.
In Washington, also funded by Sam Rubin.
Where I was an intern, by the way, in the summer of 1989.
Oh boy, okay. Small circle.
Yes.
So that it was located in a stunning building across from the Van Gogh Museum, across from the Stedelijk Museum, which is one of the most extraordinary modern art museums in the world. And Eqbal set this up as a network organization before computers. And it was amazing.
What year are we talking now? 70s?
Early 70s. After his trial, which ended, he was on trial, was exonerated.
Let's talk about that quickly, because that's so fascinating. What was he on trial for?
He
plotting a conspiracy.
To kidnap Henry Kissinger, which he never intended to do. He wanted to sort of corral him and interrogate him and film it and then release him. And the people around him who heard this thought he was nuts, because if you try to corral someone like Henry Kissinger, it could lead to violence. He was then the national security advisor of President Nixon. So you don't just blithely go and sort of corral someone like that. He's usually surrounded with security guards, and that could lead to a lot of violence. Anyway, he brought this up at a meeting in his mother-in-law's house in Connecticut with Catholic friends who were embedded in the anti-war Catholic movement.
Like the Berrigan brothers.
One of the brothers was in jail, the other one was on the lam.
Yes, which
Dan
Eqbal
Berrigan.
helped.
He organized Daniel Berrigan's escape from the FBI with 200 FBI agents trying to find him. Eqbal put Dan into many different homes, including a friend's home of my own, which was empty, and I said, why not?
It was sort of an underground railroad that helped Berrigan evade the law.
And the FBI director, Hoover, was furious that they couldn't catch him. This was 4 months on the lam. Anyway, Eqbal was put on trial for trying to kidnap Henry Kissinger, for plotting to bomb heating tunnels in Washington, and for raiding draft boards to spill blood on them and ruining the records. Those were heady times, and a lot of people did a lot of things that no longer people do.
He was exonerated, however.
A jury in Harrisburg threw out the case. But Hoover needed more funding, and he needed to get the attention of Congress. And therefore, he put on trial 7 people, including nuns and priests, and Eqbal Ahmad, a foreigner, which would make it more juicy. And it tied up their lives and my life for 14 months. And we had to raise...
The legal case that had to be built, the defense, the meetings, the endless strategizing.
And we had to raise $1 million, which was no easy feat. Money came in from people like Catch-22 author, $1,000. The head of the farm labor...
Joseph Heller.
We got money from... My sister even wrote a check for $1,000 because she met Eqbal twice and loved him. You met him and you had to fall in love with the guy. He was extraordinary. He was...
charismatic.
And he also was an aristocrat, an Indian aristocrat, which was rare in America, and had all these airs, but he was down to earth. He wasn't aloof. And he charmed people. He was Mr. Charm. And brilliant. So people remembered him once they met him.
And you make that case persuasively in the book. People from all over the world who met Eqbal, one of the things that seems common in their reminiscences about him was this mesmerizing effect, his charisma.
It was more than that. Great writers from Africa would come to the States and beeline right directly to Amherst to visit with Eqbal. It was unbelievable. And there was a parade of people who came through. And that's how he got his information, which you can't get from books, you can't get from TV. You have to speak with artists, writers, and he understood this in order to get the pulse of dictatorship, which he was writing about.
Exactly.
And he hated dictators.
With a passion.
With passion.
And in fact, let's talk about that a little bit, Stuart, because now we're jumping all over the place, for which I'm sorry, but there's just so much here in this book, in this extraordinary life that you chronicle. I suppose. But there are threads we're leaving hanging here, but so be it. His hatred of dictatorship, one of the things that I find so intriguing about Eqbal is he was a passionate champion of anti-colonial liberation struggles and independence movements in the Third World, particularly in North Africa, where he spent so many years working closely with Tunisian and Algerian revolutionaries. So Algeria, as it was for many writers and intellectuals and activists all over the world, Algeria was a real mecca and cause for so many. And Eqbal spent quite a number of years on the Algerian Revolution, but he did it mostly from Tunis. Talk about that milieu a little bit.
Eqbal went to Tunis in early 1961 for the first time. And he was there to research his PhD dissertation on the labor movement, first in Tunisia and Morocco. He was shut out of Morocco by the director of the labor movement because his questions were much too astute. You have to play dumb when you're doing research, and Eqbal didn't know how to play dumb. He was just asked questions.
And they wanted sycophantic, the fact that he would not play sycophantic with these various...
No, he was a third world person, and he thought that he would come in and be welcomed. they saw that he was too intelligent and would see right through what they were up to. So he had to deal only with Tunisia. And there, he befriended one of the 7 founders of the Algerian Revolution, who was his brother. I mean, they were always together. And through him, he learned how to foment a revolution, how to keep it alive, how to organize the metropole, in that case France, to bring over French people to the Algerian revolutionary cause. And the president of Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba, who in his early years was fascinating, after '67 when he had a stroke, other people took over for him, and he was the facade of a government. But in the early years, he was extraordinary. And he wanted Eqbal to write his biography. Happily, he didn't do it because he would have had to lie. Because when you write the biography of a president, you can't tell the truth.
Especially an authorized biography, which
That's right.
this was going to be.
Yeah, so he declined the honor. Instead, he was the acting head of the Tunisian Cultural Center in the town of Hammamet, and there he would host, and this is the beginning of the Transnational Institute, getting back to that.
Yes.
He learned how to be a gracious host to intellectuals, to playwrights, to musicians, and he did this for a year and a half. And I was there too. I spent 3 months with him at that time.
And this is in the early 60s.
Early 60s. Now, the people around him were absolutely extraordinary. He cultivated the best journalists who flocked to Tunisia to report on Algeria because it was too dangerous to live in Algeria.
Right.
He became best friends with the New York Times correspondent who covered Algeria, who was one of the most incredible journalists the New York Times had. His name was Tom Brady. And they were inseparable. They were always together. The French journalists came through. Lacouture, who is world famous, and wrote many, many biographies of famous people. Lacouture loved Eqbal. He was always with him when he came to Tunis. Plus the Algerian revolutionaries, plus graduate students from America who were doing their PhD dissertations there. Arlie Russell was the daughter of the Tunisian ambassador. She later married Adam Hochschild, who is a famous writer now. He writes
King Leopold's Ghost.
Yes.
And the history of the anti-slavery movement in Britain and so forth.
And World War I, et cetera, et cetera. And she became the preeminent writer on women's work in America and chaired the Department of Sociology at Berkeley in California. And the two of them were his best friends. Once people met him, they latched onto him. They didn't want to let go. And
so Eqbal at that time was really in a unique position. He was a curator, in effect, and organizer of cross currents of intellectuals, writers, artists, and people in the arts.
This is where he learned what to do for the Transnational Institute.
Right.
What he did in the Transnational Institute was set up a center where third world scholars would be able to interact with first world scholars. And he provided an atmosphere. The dinners were extraordinary. They were like ping pong. And everybody participated. He had a way of drawing out the best in people, the way Edward Said also did. You felt as if you were the center of the world when you ate at Edward's table or Eqbal's table, because they would draw the attention of everybody to you and ask you questions, and then turn to the next person and the next person, and then the conversation would start. And it was scintillating. And he got the people who were there published. He had 1 million connections.
So he conducted these sorts of conversations and cross-pollinations all over the world, in Tunisia, in Amsterdam, in his apartment in New York City.
And later in Pakistan.
That's what I was going to get to. So at the end of his life, after he retires from teaching at Hampshire College.
Even before.
Okay. Yeah, he was already, as you say, already planting the seeds.
In the 70s, he began going back to Pakistan after being in America since 1958. And I was with him on one trip in 1980. We went to a conference in New Delhi on the future of the economy of Asia, sponsored by UNESCO. And then we went to Pakistan, and I never saw him as happy as that in my life. It was like a fish coming back to water. It was so extraordinary, and his friends were also extraordinary. He managed to find the best Pakistanis, the best Indians, and it was scintillating to be at their table. It was unbelievable.
And he made a point of forging, he and others made a point of forging these transnational connections between Indians and Pakistani civil society activists.
And the greater world.
Yes.
He put them in touch with the greater world,
Right.
got them published in the greater world. And more than that, the most important he did was give clarity to the groups he joined. He was able to help them forecast with precision what they were about, where they were going, instead of floundering as most leftists were doing, not knowing the time of day, where the priorities were. His brain was at work. And in the process of doing so, he helped them direct where they were going and get to goals.
Yes.
And to achieve those goals. And they all appreciated it.
He was strategic in that sense.
He was incredible for that.
And Stuart, one of the themes I really want to explore a bit before we conclude our conversation is that, on the one hand, Eqbal was a champion of the cause of anti-colonial struggle. And he participated directly in those struggles, intellectually and directly as an organizer. He also later, however, came to feel what you describe as a sense of disgust and disillusionment with many of the regimes that emerged out of those anti-colonial struggles and national liberation movements.
Here's where Frantz Fanon comes in.
Yes.
We never met Fanon. Fanon had died before Eqbal came to North Africa.
Shortly before.
Yeah. Fanon was already in a Maryland hospital, dying of leukemia. And on the other hand, we read everything he wrote in French when it first came out. And the biggest contribution Fanon made to post-colonial theory was his notion that because the elite was so connected with imperialism, when independence came, beware. They would step into the shoes of the colonialists, and colonialism would follow in a neo-colonial model. And Eqbal and I became aware of this way before Americans did, because we were reading it as it was coming out in French. And it was very important because Eqbal was aware that those elites that had allied themselves with the imperial power were the greatest danger after independence. And many, many states were ruled by these people. And therefore, even though people won their independence, the struggle had just begun to liberate them. And Eqbal joined that liberation struggle.
Right.
against dictatorial regimes that were following in the footsteps of the colonial powers.
And he saw this up front, didn't he?
Before anybody.
And you describe one particular meeting that I think is very salient, in which I think it was a labor federation, either in Algeria or Tunisia.
Algeria.
It was Algerian labor, the Algerian labor movement, and Eqbal saw authoritarian tendencies very strongly.
In 1967, Eqbal and I traveled, it may have been earlier, Eqbal and I traveled to Algiers, where the Algerian Labor Union was having its most important convention after independence. And Ben Bella, who was then allied with the Army Chief of Staff, Boumediene.
Just to be clear, Ben Bella had been one of the key leaders of the FLN.
He was also one of the 7 fomenters of the Algerian Revolution.
Right.
And
Major figure.
He was imprisoned during most of the war, and therefore survived because of that. French prison. He allied himself with Boumediene, who later became a dictator, military commander. And Eqbal and I were sitting there and watched as the elected delegates of the labor union were all arrested and rounded up and put into jail, and busloads of peasants were brought into the hall to replace them. Eqbal went bonanza. He couldn't believe this. And he went up to the podium, and this was very dangerous to do. Ben Bella was backed by the military. It was moving towards dictatorship. He went up there and screamed in Ben Bella's face, "You betrayed the revolution. What are you doing here? Quit!" And I sat there watching this all, and I was scared for him, because at any moment the troops could have come in and arrested him, and he could have disappeared.
But he was fearless, and he was outraged.
He was totally fearless. I've never seen anybody as fearless as my friend Eqbal.
And do you think that's part of what made Eqbal so respected by people all over in these struggles in the Third World?
He couldn't be bought.
Yeah.
There was no price. But more than that, his father, who was killed with Eqbal in his arms, in the province of Bihar in India. He was a lawyer. He didn't have to practice because his wife brought a lot of land into the marriage along with gold jewelry. And therefore he was a lawyer who did not practice, but when peasants were exploited, and Bihar was the most exploited province of India, he either would take the case if he thought he could win and go to the court with it, or if he didn't think he could win, he would give either some of his own land or his wife's land to that peasant. As a result of that, the landlords in the province had him killed in 1937 with Eqbal in his arms.
Young, very young, wasn't he?
He was 7.
Huh.
And he became catatonic.
What a traumatic event.
But that was the basis of his originality. In his cocoon, he began seeing the world very differently from everybody else. It reminds me of Oscar in Gunter Grass's great book and film. It was amazing. And then his brother, who took him after his father died because his mother feared that her children would be kidnapped, took him to his town. The brother was the tax inspector of Pakistan, the first one. He was the Robespierre of Pakistan. he couldn't be corrupted. He was totally incorruptible. And he raised Eqbal. Well, after that, your father is killed because he gives land to landless peasants, and your brother is incorruptible, the Robespierre of Pakistan. What are you going to turn out? You have to be honest. You have to be a fighter, and you have to be fearless. So it's his childhood that shaped him into somebody who was totally unique.
Well, Stuart, I must say that in this extraordinary biography of Eqbal Ahmad, you have done justice to a rather unique life. And I think, especially because Eqbal, as you noted at the beginning of this conversation, never published that big book, for which his good friend Edward Said chastised him in public, and because he wanted him to write a great book. Eqbal never did that because he was so busy doing all of the things we've been talking about. And yet, it's precisely for that reason that this book, I think, is so important. It really places Eqbal and his significance in context.
I wrote it so that he would not be forgotten.
Yes.
And that people should read his works, and they've all been collected. Columbia University Press published a very fat volume of his writings, and his daughter, Dora Ahmed, and others published his writings on Pakistan for Oxford University Press in Pakistan. And David Barsamian did 2 books about him, interviews that are precious, that are absolutely extraordinary.
Those books preceded this book, but this book, I think, is really unique because you tell the whole story. It's a biography that really, I think, does...
Well, I accepted nothing. I started with the premise I had to start from the beginning.
Yes.
Because all interesting characters are surrounded by myth. And what I wanted to do was the research that would demystify the man and concentrate on his intellectual prowess, which was combined with amazing activism. I used to be afraid to go visit him in his apartment because he would mobilize me to do something. And I had a busy life, you know, it was difficult. So I only went to see him, and that was often, when I didn't have something on my agenda, when I was able to spare 10 or 15 hours to get something else done.
and I imagine it would have been...
get me organized on.
I can imagine it would have been hard to say no to Eqbal, too.
You couldn't say no. I mean, it was, he had too much passion.
His powers of persuasion. Well, this is a fantastic book, Stuart, and I'm thrilled that we had a chance to discuss it here in Denver today. Thank you so much for writing this book.
He loved being in Colorado. He gave one of his best talks of his life in Boulder.
That's right, and David Barsamian, who you just mentioned, recorded that for his radio show, Alternative Radio.
And it's the best talk he ever gave in his life, and he gave great talks all the time.
He was an extraordinary lecturer, wasn't he?
Oh, he was sublime. Sublime.
Thanks for writing this book, Stuart, and for chatting with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.